There we go. All right, welcome back to the Coaching Collective podcast. So today we have with us George Wilson from Flex Success. So George has been someone I've followed on along for quite a while, and obviously is pretty well known around Australia despite not being in Australia. And have heard nothing but good things about George from a number of friends, number of people that I really trust as well. So without further ado, man, if you don't mind, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you're at, what you do.
Appreciate that intro, man. Yep, my name's George. I am a physique development coach. I specifically or predominantly work in the competitive bodybuilding space, covering both males and females alike. Interestingly enough, like you mentioned, I'm from the UK, but weirdly don't actually coach any UK people. Haven't done
Really?
for
Yeah.
everything all international, with the majority being obviously Australian dominant. I've been coaching sort of just over sort of 5 years now, so maybe not the longest of timelines for some people, but in that time, we've just pretty much funneled in on my niche, which happens to be within the taboo subjects within our sport, the more interesting hush hush conversations, which I guess that interest has enabled me to get into the athlete space relatively efficiently. I started coaching part time, as most people do, working on site, and just general progression over time, worked my way up into the right position to be found by Flex.
So how did that happen actually?
So, from a man of common interest between all of us, Joe Jeffrey was bodybuilding and competing at the time, coached by Joe. I actually was on his old mentorship scheme that he used to run. It was like Joe is this invaluable human of resource from all things, not just physique development. He even helped me massively in regard to like spiritual growth and career growth. You know, he was so fully invested, and it's rare to come across a person who generally wants to see you do well for you, not for some gain for him.
Mhm.
So through that, we was having some conversation around like the physique collective at the time, and potential opportunities that might have been arising. And he just started working with Dean. Put Dean on stage, prep Dean, and there was kind of like this. I was around Joe quite a lot, going to shows, met Dean and Lizzie, and Dean mentioned to Joe that he wanted a coach and he was looking for a coach. Hopefully, quite funnily, someone to break into the UK market.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
apparently was that guy. It didn't really work out that way. It didn't really break into the UK market, but that was the intention. And Joe recommended me for the job. After one catch up, one conversation, it was kind of history from there forth. They'd made the decision.
Cool. And were you working for yourself prior to this as well with your own
Yeah,
client? Yeah.
yeah, all on my own, just fighting the good fight solo, gem pop, trying to build my old brand GW Physique up into something that I kind of once upon a time looked at Joe and obviously people like Dean in his position and kind of maybe wanted to align myself on that.
Mhm.
But the more further into coaching I got, man, the more I realized I just want to coach. Like I'm not as concerned about being the guy at the top, having all of the systems in play and running the business. I just love coaching. And Dean and Liz, the epic humans that they are, have given me a platform and an ability to just coach and educate. Like that's all I have to do.
Yeah, and that also allows you to be really like dialed in on the skill set as well. Yeah, because with us, that's pretty much what my brother does for me too. And running that back end, it does. You need to put in the hours, which aren't the ideal hours. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
It would take away from education time for me, from time where I want to be putting into my personal interest of learning things, working on specific client cases. It would take away from that if I was trying to worry about all the administrative tasks.
And I do feel like as well, you and Dean come together so well too that it makes it
Yeah.
so workable. Do you think there's a reason why you never broke into the UK market, or do you think it was just the nature of the
Because
client?
when he took me on, he didn't. He come at me with a boatload of clients. Dean had this, and no, I'm not ill and avoid to the fact that my progression into Oz's competitive space was very much leveraged by the fact that he had a market waiting for him. He had a wait list as long as his bloody arm. For obvious reasons, he's fantastic at his job in numerous different ways. But that meant that I kind of come in and had this pool of people to talk to and to try and see if they wanted to put trust in me and give me a go. Unfortunately, there was enough of them to essentially build a roster. So Dean wanted me to break into the UK space. He gave me too much option and
Mhm.
choice to kick off with at the beginning. So it just become very Aussie dominated straight away. Very, very much straight away. And as you can imagine, interactions on Instagram and socials over the last few years have meant that when I put posts out, typically algorithms go to Australian market. It's over that side of the world where my face sort of pops up more.
And is there specific areas of interest in like clientele that you've sort of taken as well? Like, let's just say before you started with Flex, as well as after where that's headed.
So before Flex, it already started to move into the female, well, I should say no, enhancement and also female niche.
Yeah.
So for me, like I said, Taboo was my interest. So even before Dean and Flex, the reason why I even hired Joe in the first place was to start diving further deeper into pharmacology and understanding AAS in the male perspective as well as the female. So prior to that, I'd already put an athlete on stage before, coaching with Flex, my partner Zoe. So she was my first female. She's also my first competitive athlete, and also took a good couple of golds and an overall in a season with me. So it was a pretty good introduction into the competitive space, right when Dean was sort of had me on his radar. So it was kind of all well timed.
Hmm.
Uh, Apart from her, it was all Gen Pop prior, and then Dean just kind of opened that capacity up for me, him and Liz.
Hmm. And did you have trouble sort of like establishing that trust amongst the new clients as well, or was that pretty quickly to sort of close?
Again, I look at the leverage provided for me, and that Dean is so well respected in Australia, him and Liz, of course, and the brand that they've built, that it meant that if Dean spoke highly of me or spoke good of me, then quite a lot of people that were interested in him also then were able to then invest in me.
Yeah, of course. Oh, so yeah, so obviously that works out really well as well. Yeah, because like Dean here is like the master, but the
It's
master
been
he doesn't
nice.
live here though. Yeah, that's what we.
It, it's been an interesting transition, I will say, because over time, over the last few years, applications that were once, Dean, but happy to go with someone else if necessary, have
Mhm.
now slowly started saying George a bit more, as George, the coach for Flex, has started to embody his own persona and his own kind of staple in the industry, which has been a really nice progression to see over the last few years.
And I will ask a very specific question to what you're spoken about, coaching your partner.
Ooh.
I coached Izzy for 2 years. How was that?
So the situation kind of leads into our topic of conversation today quite well. But I watched my partner compete naturally with a prior coach, and I will not throw shade toward him, but some things weren't maintained or handled in the post-show window as well as they should have been. And my limited knowledge at the time back then was still enough to see that she'd been amenorrheic for sort of 12 months, and there was no conversation or action being taken to improve that and get that back into the right working order. So after sort of 12 months, I put my foot down and said enough's enough. Like explained the reasons why this low estrogenic environment was terrible for her health consequences as well as reproductive. And she decided to put her faith in me to correct those issues. And sort of within 6 months, we had her back functioning and all efficiently as she should have been. And at that point, I kind of earned the trust from her to then know that I always had her best interest at heart, which then allowed for our coaching relationship competitively to be very separated. Usually, the problem is being able to separate and individualize coach and partner. So when the female or the male, whoever it is looking at the coach, they've got two different people in front of them, a coach and a partner, and there's a responsibility on the client to be able to appreciate those two different separate identities, but then also the coach to be able to differentiate between those two identities when necessary. You've got the person who's telling you the instructions that are usually leading to you going back home to your partner going, oh, for fuck's sake, you dropped my food again, I feel like shit, I'm tired, I'm prepped. Like, that's the person you console with, who is also the person instructing and making these changes. So it creates a weird demographic between the two of you that you have to navigate. But because of that trust that was built in correcting her internal hormonal issues, it left a good stepping stone for us to move into the competitive relationship as coach client with a good level of trust. So with that full level of trust, it meant I could just do my job. She would follow instructions, and yeah, it all kind of worked out pretty well.
No, that's cool. Yeah, we had trouble more so just with that separation as well. We're probably more so on her end, but
Yeah,
one of the biggest things I've just listened just a few podcasts I've overheard things as well where there's two ways it goes when you coach a partner. Like outside of that emotional balance, is you either go incredibly aggressively because like it's your partner, you can't do a bad job, or you go very conservatively because it's a partner, you don't want them to be like
Yeah,
fucked up. And then
yeah,
as a result, you kind of lose either way.
yeah. No, completely.
And yeah, because obviously, if you've got that standard for someone who's a reflection of you, but it's your partner, so the reflection shines brighter.
Yeah.
You feel like, for me, this is me talking on behalf of myself. You feel like that you need to do an even better job compared to like if it was just a run-of-the-mill client, because a run-of-the-mill client, it sort of falls back on them too.
Mhm.
You just get a random person, hit your inquiry box, you're coaching them, you don't know them on a personal level. If they deliver at 80%, the judgment there is a little bit less like well,
Mhm.
they could have done this, they could have done this. Where if it's a partner, it's like, well, they would have been with them 24/7 to know
So
what's going
why wasn't this, yeah, why weren't these low-hanging fruits addressed, or what was the reasoning? You're there 24/7 with each
on.
other.
Yeah.
I found it quite easy to separate myself off from that personality, to be honest. Toward the back end, you're so separate from your partner anyway when they're competing because of the internal fatigue,
Yeah.
hormonal changes, the shell of a person that you're kind of looking at also I found like it enabled me to be able to detach from the emotional side. Like there was a point from about 6 weeks out where me and Zoe were just coach client. We were
Yeah.
living in the same house, we're still under all the same confinements, but we were just coach client at that point. The relationship was very much unbalanced toward that. And
Yeah.
then obviously the scale swings back the other way, of course.
Hmm.
Yeah. I honestly think our situation would have been significantly better and probably would have worked out okay if I didn't like work for Michael because I like don't run my own business. I work under him. So it wasn't just he was my partner and my coach, he was also my boss. So say in a period of time whereby like I was 6 weeks out, work stress as well was really high. We'd recently let go of an employee, so I took on like all of her roles as well. It was just like super, super hard to balance like any support, and I struggled too with like driving a wedge between like the emotional side of everything as well. But like if we remove the work element, I think it would have been significantly better and a more positive experience.
That's a whole other complicated relationship to throw into the
Yeah.
kind of power dynamic between boss, employee
Yeah.
as well, partner, and also coach client. Yes, that sounds sticky, even by my
Yeah.
account.
You
Yeah,
live and
no,
you
it
learn,
was
but
yeah. Uh,
yeah.
yeah. It's
It's a
go on, go on.
it was a part of the reason why, I mean, me and Dean have had this conversation when I started with Flex, where I was a bit like, oh, if I coach for him, does that mean I have to also be a client of his? And yeah, he very quickly assured me that he does not want to coach anyone that he works with because of that like bleeding of the two spaces that can arise.
Yeah. Who do you get coached by?
Sorry?
Who do you get coached by?
I run all my own stuff now. So I guess for me personally, my identity in the last sort of 12 months has definitely taken a shift into the embodiment of coach as opposed to bodybuilder and coach and trying to, do both at the same time. No real reason, bar just I can see a higher return of one enjoyment coming from putting my energy into coaching. It's not about financials. Obviously, coaching is going to do you much better for me and my genetic pool anyway compared to what bodybuilding would have returned me. That's for sure. But I get more enjoyment out of life being the coach, being able to travel around and sharing the success of any and also losses of all of my athletes being there in the emotional state. That brings me more than what my own competitive goals did.
Mhm.
And I'm a man who likes to achieve highly. And thus, the fact that I look at again, this sounds like an excuse or a cop out, but I look at my genetic kind of plate within family history, a couple of quite serious heart issues that run down my family history. I then look at my genetic potential just in regard to facility of growth and how many years I'd put into bodybuilding and also enhanced bodybuilding as well. I've been doing this for like 8 years enhanced, another 5 years prior to that natural, and all to a relatively high level of input and regard, tracking nutrition training for years. And
Mhm.
I just didn't seem to have the return that I started to see from clients that just got into this space. They smell a bit of testosterone and all of a sudden they're just blowing up at a capacity you can't kind of fathom. And
Mhm.
when you start to see that, it puts things into perspective and it gives you a different eye to kind of reassess your own and go, what trade-off am I getting here in trying to chase this card or this next goal? What is it? And when you weigh everything up, a few echocardiograms that were descending in the wrong way had me go, what am I doing this for? Am I going to keep taking the drugs to try and facilitate an empty goal, or am I going to commit myself into something that could bring me a good, heartwarming return for a long, long, long time?
Yeah, because I personally, I always say this to everyone, I couldn't live without coaching, no matter how much money you gave me. But I had that mentality. Like I completely like understand your perspective as well. I had that mentality for probably the last 3 years. And it was probably only when I actually got started getting coached by Joe where I kind of realized, like, no, I'm not done. Like I want
Yeah.
to try again. And like you said, you're 27, so you might get to that point again. Um, But for me, it was the moment, like the show that I mentioned that I met you at before. That was my main moment because I remember I had the clients and had one guy who looked quite good, and then I almost felt like I didn't belong in there. But when I say I'd let it go, it would have been like a good 12 months of training twice a week on 115 milligrams of testosterone
Yeah.
after umbilical surgery, which puts me out of training for 8 weeks. And that was when I had that moment where I'm like, no, no, you know what? I got to give this another go. But not even that. Like for me, it's more about just I want more experience for my own application too.
Mm.
Like I
Yeah.
feel like how many shows have you done?
Only two. Only
Okay.
two.
Yep. See, like I just felt like by getting another couple of seasons under my belt, it will really give me that ability to resonate with the client because I've done shows, but in fairness, in the shows that I've done is when I was quite clueless to bodybuilding and they weren't done well. And they weren't not done well because I didn't put in the work and didn't do a good job. I just didn't understand it.
Yeah.
It was just I did it because I thought it was cool and it was the thing to do at the time.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
now, like I understand every in and out of it,
Yeah.
which I wish that I got into that, like enjoy that passion of it a little bit earlier.
Mm.
Because even when I started prepping clients, man, it wasn't like I was super passionate about bodybuilding at the start. I just prepped a couple. I'm like, this is fun and I've done a good job. I remember my first time on a pro card in like a natural federation. And I was like,
Yeah.
maybe I'm good at this. Yeah, it wasn't like an underlying burning passion for bodybuilding. Like I was passionate about bodybuilding when I was like really young.
Mm.
But that was probably around the time the men's physique category first came out. I remember when like, do you remember Sadiq and Jeremy Buendia and stuff?
Yeah. 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 The good old days of men's physique.
Yeah, that was when for me I got really into it. Yeah, I would have been like 19, 20, and then yeah, as the years went on, not now I'm the most into it I've ever been, but I don't know what it was, man, because men's physique started to sort of sh those guys as well. They were cool. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. The
but
persona that went with it. It was attractive. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, they were just, and like they had personalities. They were doing good vlogs. They didn't seem like they were suffering on the vlogs. You know, you watch some guys in prep and you watch their videos and they're like zombies, which
Yeah. Yeah.
fair enough. But like, it's not like you watch it and you're like, oh, like I want
Mm.
that when you're just a beginner.
No,
You look at it
absolutely.
like, all right, click out of this. I'm bored. Not that Jeremy and Sadiq are the best examples in the world, in fairness, for personality, but yeah, at least I got a
Yeah.
bit of spark. Yeah.
Ego, personality. I guess the two kind of overlap.
Yeah, because there was a really, but I'm going way off track, but there was a really interesting podcast actually from Jeremy the other week was released with Haney or Hani, I always.
Yeah, that's on my watch list actually. I haven't actually caught up with that one yet, but I am interested because of the demographic between those two and their relationship over the years.
It's a really good listen. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was especially if you were around when you knew the issues they were having and the issues Jeremy was having. You watch that and you're like, this guy's turned it around. He's like 37 now, you'd hope so. But yeah. So I guess we can leverage into the topic. Izzy, did you want to kick this off?
In regards to what we're discussing.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel like I've got the question, but it's very vague, so maybe you could tie it down a little bit.
well, I don't know where we would start. I feel like because it is such a vague
Well, I think the biggest thing is going to be, so let's just say this.
timeline wise, discuss timeline, how you would sort of set that up, then branch off from there.
I'm thinking firstly, so a girl hits your inquiry box.
Yep.
She's natural. She wants to compete in IFBB. She wants to become enhanced. She has expectations that she can take these enhancements because she did really well in this natural show, and she's going to become an IFBB bikini pro.
Okay.
Where do we go from there?
I think some reality can sometimes be a bittersweet thing. I see a lot of these kind of well, guys and girls that get too excited in this position, but girls for the context of today.
Mhm.
Um, the first thing I'd be saying to them is, do they have long-term aspirations in competing? I typically assume straight away that answer is going to be yes, because they're probably looking for a pro card. And then I would lay out what I forecast from their current position to that goal being achieved, a reality and a timeline to say, right, this is going to probably take with your current set point, forecasting some, best scenarios and best situations, maybe looking like 5 years, maybe seven, maybe 10, whatever it actually looks like. And then the first thing is that rebuttal straight away where they go, oh, well, why? No, no, no way. This girl, X, Y, Z, da, 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 da.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. Right, let's now break down the nitty-gritty of what you're asking me. So you want to jump onto PEDs, you want to try and upregulate your progress quite aggressively and try and achieve this goal in the short term, but are you aware of the trade-off that comes with this? Would you be willing to half undergo transgender therapy to achieve a pro card? And usually there's all of a sudden a couple of changes in the facial expressions as to, oh, okay, maybe we need some more information here before we start making those decisions. So then we start running through the potential negatives, side effects, risks of pushing too fast or trying to achieve this at such a pace, that usually ends up having a conversation where they see some reality and go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, okay. And then all of a sudden we're back on the same level. We can start to look at an actual appropriate timeline.
Hmm. One of the issues I actually observed, I had a girl inquire the other day actually, and she asked about PEDs, and I sent her a little bit of a loom just summarizing because she was a bit on the fence about signing up. She said she'd inquire with a few different people. And she was just asking a few questions about how I would set up a timeline. I went over it. And as you know, if you're going down like the most sustainable kind of models, there is a fair few more moving parts
Hmm.
than the typical route, which we'll get to. And she came back at me and said, why wouldn't I just do Anavar? And then I sort of went over the longevity there and how far off she was and how we wouldn't be able to sustain that. And then the whole tone changed completely. But I think one of the things to touch on is like there is a lot of moving parts if you want to get female
Yep.
pharmaceutical like into a sustainable place. But not
Yep.
only that, which I'm sure you'll add to on this, that sustainable place is not going to amplify progress in the same way as a male running their first blast. It's just going to be a little bit of, it's more going to be polishing that and
Yep.
optimizing that and getting maybe adding like 50% of returns and 50% potentially generous. And that would add up over 1, 2, 3 years. But no one wants to hear that.
No, not at all.
Mm.
So I guess the timeline considerations, if we look at kind of firstly the natural situation, when we look at general overview of overarching changes between a male and female demographic, the female typically all phases are going to be longer. And the reason why is that we typically can't be as reactive with females as we are with males in those short-term decision making. And thus we see this most heavily when you draw back the lens and look at the one thing that mainly separates us, which is the menstrual cycle, that wonderful, amazing thing that should be celebrated and not demonized or hated on as much as what it is. It's a pretty fucking unique quality to females. So this kind of sets the demographic now to look back and go, right, we can't look at you from one week to the next with complete certainty in our decision making because of the fluctuations that can arise in this natural female. We must extrapolate, look back further. We're probably going to be comparing imagery from similar points of phases within the menstrual cycle. So follicular phase, depending on how much you want to separate that up, early, mid, late, or just early, late. Luteal phase, the same. You can then overarch and look between comparison of imagery and assessments, which just again requires more time because we're not being as reactive from one week to the next. So the prep itself is typically going to be longer anyway. We look at the off-season considerations or prep, I guess, in that transitional window. You can put this next bit any way you want. Post-show recovery. That's a phase that can either be attached to the end of comp prep as the final thing that needs to be done or the first thing of the off-season. I don't care where you decide to put it, but it needs to be achieved. And this is the biggest thing that sets up the tone for the off-season because if your regulation of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, everything isn't back in the natural position, we're not going to be getting any great return on investment from the off-season. There's no point. We've got to get that back first, then embark on our next journey. So the off-season, this whole like season to season competing window that we see from most girls typically in bikini in the IFBB year after year after year, putting on the same physique on stage every single time, maybe a little bit worse and regressed, is coming from again this lack of time that's giving. So first thing for any female listening is just time. Every phase, prep, off season, give yourself more time. So that's assuming that we're under the natural laws of physique development, which, as we know, naturally progressing and making muscularity improvements takes a hell of a long time. Now, we cannot regulate those parameters by moving into the enhanced space with performance enhancing drugs. And females have this kind of umbrella of opportunity to maximize on leverages that are not going to cost them too much in negative trade off before having that conversation as to the last jump. There is an order to which we should look at enhancement practice with women. And the first starts with non-virilizing PEDs. So these are the PEDs that don't come with that androgenic profile and consequence that is driving masculizing effects. When we come to the AAS conversation, anabolic and androgenic steroids, the biggest consequence and biggest drawback here is the virilization consequence, which is the masculizing effects that occur to women when exposed to high androgens in their blood serum. So this non-virilizing PED realm is both wonderful, but also a little bit sneaky in that it can sell you that this is being enhanced. But like you said quite rightly, they're even in the enhanced space. The trade-off really isn't the same. When we compare sort of the list of non-virilizing drugs would be growth hormone, things like insulin, metformin, telmisartan, L-carnitine, just to name a few. And if we start looking at the individual case by case situations here between a male and female dimorphic difference in effect, the growth hormone seems to have similar effects in lipolysis, anti-lipogenesis across males and females, but different regarding hypertrophy. And arguably, hypertrophy driven from growth hormone in isolation is little to none at best, realistically, right? It's that IGF-1 activity in males that's driving this response. In females, don't seem to get the same. Does that mean it doesn't carry indirect benefit? That's up for debate now when we start to look at the improvement in energy systems by utilizing fat more efficiently for fuel. We can stay leaner. We can improve net insulin sensitivity over time by staying leaner and in a better composition, extrapolate longer progress because of staying leaner. And this can all compound into greater indirect progress over the longer term. Insulin can be used in much the same way as a male. We can utilize it based on food leverage. So we look at total carbohydrate amount, pancreatic capacity to cope with said food for basal use, and then rapid usage would then again come down to peri-workout nutrient affinities. And obviously now making sure optimal amount of carbohydrates is utilized pre and post workout to get away with using fast acting insulin. Benefit there is improvements in assimilation of fuel sources that are going to provide training capacity and also thus recovery in the post workout setting. Again, a small 1%, but it does over time, over the long term, providing the need is there, extrapolate to longer term progression. Metformin and telmisartan are much more indirect in that they're improvements in again, energy assimilation via insulin sensitivity with metformin's prime mechanism and PPAR activity of telmisartan. We then see again net better outcomes from the systems at play within hypertrophy or physique development. Just an upregulation of ability to use energy is going to lead to indirect longer term progression. There are some interesting lipolytics that I find come up within female enhancement practice. One specific that can be utilized in the off season that people often overlook, and that's clenbuterol. And obviously in prep, it makes a lot of sense. Great for lipolysis, great for shifting energy balance without having to touch food and expenditure. Awesome. But in the off season, I think people often overlook its potent effect for anti-catabolism. And if we take a look at females that fall under that group of androgen sensitive females, we know that clenbuterol with its beta 2 androgenic action binds at androgenic receptors, beta 2 specifically, and females have slightly denser beta 2 androgenic receptors. There is a slightly greater response from clenbuterol to women, which is where we see that anti-catabolic effect seemingly be a little better in women than men. So if we then extrapolate that to the off season and we take females that are androgen sensitive and give them something that's promoting anti-catabolism, there's a similar smaller overlap to mimicking like effect of an androgen that will promote growth promotion in the long term. But obviously, Clen is not this drug we can run indefinitely. The longer the exposure, the safety profile does improve, which is awesome. But we can't just run it forever now, otherwise it'd still be used in asthma treatment to this day. We obviously see cardiac risk. So, periodization of clenbuterol in an off season can be interesting. If you leverage it in the mini cut to support your outcome and processes quicker, you can keep it into the surplus out the backside with a low dose. It's still driving that anti-catabolic effect enough that it's not suppressing appetite, and then you're going to layer this additional 1% into the timeline and gain a little bit additional leverage on hypertrophy outcomes for that window of opportunity. But all of these would be covered prior to considering the next step in enhancement practice.
Mm-hmm.
So far, because I'm just waffling, I don't want to.
Yeah, no, I know. You went at that very, very well. I was actually quite impressed with your recall as well. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, with the clenbuterol as well, in regards to, I will just ask just a practical experience as well, because I'm aware of it in regards to the ability to prevent catabolic activity. But have you observed these kind of improvements in these kind of phases with clenbuterol's administration, or do you believe
So
you've seen it to such an extent that it is noticeable?
I look at this as one of those things that we know on paper work drives this response, and thus is such a 1% we should be considering it if we want to tick every box. I'm not going to sit here and try and say that anecdotally I can see, like with androgen usage, like if you see a female on Anavar, you're going to see that change very quickly over that X weeks of exposure. Clenbuterol is not the same, but it's the same. We have that conversation on growth hormone as well, right? It's about chronic exposure, or what things can we utilize for as long as possible, as frequently as possible without deleterious deleterious consequence, and those 1% over the longer time frame adding up and accumulating to longer net results. So I wouldn't say clenbuterol you'll see the progression in muscularity. You'll obviously see them hold a much leaner composition,
Mm.
which at different weights, you might start looking and going, oh, yeah, cool. Yeah, there has been some progress there, but
Mhm.
it's not the same as looking by eye to steroid usage in a female where they suddenly start changing aggressively.
Of course. Now, the reason I actually asked is because there is individuals who I have like you use clenbuterol typically in a deficit, of course, and I have compared that to previous like deficit phases, compreps, etc., where they've done that naturally, and you do notice whether it be that they're just like you're just perceiving like there's more tissue retention, or whether there genuinely is more tissue retention. It's something which I've noticed a few times, but only on specific individuals. Certain
Yeah, so
times, more often than not, it's you're not going to notice. Obviously, you're not going to notice it. It's more because I've had females run that in isolation.
if you then see, or if you've got females that are using anabolic and androgenic steroids, and you then try and quantify what that looks like and the difference there, it's almost like next to none to see. So it's always going to be one of those 1% that are happening in the background to support processes, but we make a lot of decisions because we know it benefits us without really seeing the trade-off in that like short term. So it's just one of those cases.
Yeah. Did you have any questions to take from that, Izzy, or to raise from there?
Really, that was explained extremely well.
They made that
And it's
incredible.
nice listening to something that's being explained and it all like makes sense.
Yeah, because
So
I feel like as well, anyone for anyone listening to that too, that's the best probably snapshot of non-androgenic pathways
yeah,
and what the expectations of non-androgenic pathways, etc., compared to almost anything that you could probably find available without trying to
which
fatigue.
I
Yeah.
think as well, it's extremely refreshing. I don't know whether or not it's because you're from the UK as well. I don't know whether or not you've picked up on how, like in Australia, say if you're discussing females and the use of like insulin or even growth hormone, it's such a taboo thing here. But people will eat like Anavars, like Tic Tacs, and have no issues whatsoever. But you mention any of these things, and they're like, absolutely not. And then someone will post it on their Instagram story, dragging a coach, and it's just like a bit of a mess over here. Um, Prior to majority of like your client cohort being in Australia, did you notice a difference in females' general like education levels around PEDs compared to say like Australian females compared to the UK just because of like the availability of it and information?
Absolutely. So I say, as a general consensus, females are extremely uninformed when it comes to not only enhancement practice, but their own physiology. That's what assessment I've taken over years of working with females is that majority of them don't actually fully understand even how the menstrual cycle operates and works, let alone how drugs then interact with these quite complex systems.
Yeah.
I'd say that due to the environment of bodybuilding in the UK, like, and then you can put this across the world, I guess. So I've seen it in different populations: America, UK, kind of like Eastern, Dubai, sort of Middle Eastern kind of places, and then Australia. I'd put them into the four bigger categories realistically of bodybuilding at the moment. And I find that the UK and America seem to be not necessarily leading the charge in an arrogance way, but because of the people and the coaches that we have here and the work being done, like the UK is full of coaching collaborations of great people doing good education, that our knowledge set is a little bit higher than that of, say, Middle East and Australia. And how I kind of explain Australia to people in this one specific field, especially bodybuilding as a generalization again, is that we're somewhat 5 to 10 years perhaps in the past in some conversations. So this draws back to your comment about GH and insulin. If we look back to older practices, bodybuilders in the male space as well would have this similar thought process that, you can't justify growth hormone or insulin until you're blasting over a gram of gear. And if you're not using over a gram of gear, it's not worth it and you've not earned your stripes yet. And it's like, well, what are we doing here? Why do we have to earn the right by taking this, what we know is a more toxic pathway to exploit and push quite high compared to these other pathways that we can exploit quite minimally and get great returns synergistically? So that kind of overlay of older practice is still very present in Australia, I find, or at least when I first moved into the market. I will say in the last 2 years, it is coming up to speed
Yeah.
pretty damn
It's getting better. Yeah.
absolutely. And again, I think it's just that change over years and that trickle down feed of information that kind of bro science in it kind of influences within the country. But now we're starting to see, obviously, with technology, Instagram, more wide access to this information. It is definitely stepping up, but absolutely, there's a big difference still in Australia at this moment in time. The typical consult call I have, and most of my kind of hormonal related PED work does typically come in the consult space. I help a lot of other coaches with their clients and setting up timelines and stack design and whatever else. Um, and I see this kind of very, very standard practice of like 8 to 12 weeks on, 8 to 12 weeks off, cyclically using Anavar across the timeline, but it just doesn't align with anything practice-wise that we see for these females to avoid all the negatives. We're just going to completely upregulate virilization aggressively, and there's a lot of females that come out of bodybuilding sadly not unscathed and safe and have a lot of constant permanent damage and changes done because of poor decisions made by coaches that are somewhat uneducated and uninformed on how to actually be appropriately using these drugs and compounds.
The cyclical approach of Anavar never really made sense to me as well throughout the context of an off season because you're upregulating, like, I guess, growth potential for 8 to 12 weeks, and then that's you proceed straight into a period where that's substantially downregulated depending on the individual. So almost like you wonder how, like across. So I always say to people when we're discussing PEDs, males, females, etc., you want to zoom out. And when it comes
Mhm.
to males as well, one of the big things you need to say is they want a red line. Every male wants to red line when they're young. And you say we want longevity because the progress we can make across 50 weeks, if we can sustain that theoretically, not actually 50 weeks, but if you could sustain healthy parameters for 50 weeks, that's going to be a lot better than redlining for 16 and then having to spend the next 10 getting you back to baseline. Um,
Absolutely.
and on to one of your topics too, as well, just recognizing that you can leverage into growth hormone, the insulin as well. I don't want to touch on males for too long, but as a male, the requirement for the AAS becomes not necessarily a requirement, becomes lower, but you can sit that lower and see equal to greater. I personally see far greater growth potential occur when we just, I guess, how would you put it? Touch on all the pathways rather
This is
than
a little
explore
tangent,
it
I guess.
and ignore. Yeah.
There's a little tangent here that is somewhat important in that when we think about polypharmacy and what we're actually trying to achieve, it's not about saying to the individual that you could now use less of this one pathway you've been abusing by using multiple of these. You absolutely can, but it's about getting greater return on investment. We can see this anecdotally. Every bodybuilder throughout history puts growth hormone on a pedestal at some point in their life because they think it's this holy goated
Mm.
compound. But the reality is that they're adding it in at a time when they've pushed their cycle, typically in the older practice, up to 1,000 megs, and then they're adding in a very beautifully synergistic compound to the AAS they're using. Cell proliferation, duplication of more cells with more androgen receptors, more drugs in the system, androgens to then bind to said receptors, big net upregulation and hypertrophic outcomes. So everyone thinks it was the growth hormone, but they miss off on the fact that it was not. It was actually the combination of the two that really drove that synergy and that promotion of factors of growth. We look at dwarfism research, they're not all jacked. If they were all jacked on GH trying to unlock their latent growth, we'd see that growth hormone was driving hypertrophy aggressively. So that I think that's where the people get kind of lost in the source almost in putting GH on that pedestal. But absolutely, it's not about necessarily taking less, but how can we get more out of less? How can we
Mhm.
get the biggest return on investment from taking the least amount of risk?
Mhm. One of the, yeah, because it's obviously I always explain growth hormone to individuals as more like it's almost the compound which brings everything together, but it only is doing its thing because of, I guess, what it's being paired with. And one thing I actually raised with Joe as well, one of the big concepts, which I'm sure you obviously already know the research on this, but the individuals who I notice make the most substantial progress are those who can sit estrogen very high without symptomology. You add growth hormone, and they're the ones that you start to look at in every check, and it's like, okay. Like, and that's a genetic trait in itself, because as well, again, not to go too far off track, but I feel like on from a genetic level, people think of like just their ability to add tissue as like their genetics. That's what it's closed down to. But there's so many different factors which indicate like so many genetic levels which need to be taken into account. For example, potentially your control of blood pressure when you exceed X dosage. If one person can't tolerate that, you've planted your ceiling or you're going to incur the risk. And anyone with a level head is not going to incur the risk. So just so many factors to consider there. I want to draw back to the topics from before, though. Would you consider thyroid replacement in the context of non-androgenic pathways to address, or would you consider that a completely separate?
So some of the benefits we might achieve through thyroidal super physiological dosing is some increased, free fatty oxidation, so
Oh, no,
oxidation of.
no. No, not super physiological. I don't want you to think that I think that. Yeah.
So this is why I draw back to this. It's like, well, what
Yeah.
are we doing with thyroid practice then using exogenous thyroid? We're replacing natural output, right? And unless we're super physiologically pushing it, then we're not achieving a greater degree of benefit than what the thyroid hormone producing the thyroid is doing anyway.
Mhm.
We're replacing to natural parameters, and I don't necessarily look at it as an anabolic potential pathway
Mhm.
unless we're considering exploiting it in the same way we do GH and other steroids.
The reason I do raise that is because again, I know you agree with this. Like we want to consider everything. Yes, the data will say this. Yes, we know this, but everything we want to look at indirectly as well. So if we had a female theoretically who's coming in and out of preps, in and out of preps, in and out of preps, thyroid never really sits back at baseline. Antibodies, reverse thyroid starting to accrue, etc. If we could optimize that pathway, we could potentially improve the longevity of the growth phase through their ability to retain a leaner composition. And not only that, we could optimize the deficit phases, which means across their timeline, when we incorporate those acute cutting windows, they, number one, can maintain healthy parameters. Number two, we can keep them to the window that we want. Because I'm sure you've had many times where you're coaching females where you got like a 6 week mini cut set up. You get to week 5 and you're like, fuck, like nothing's happening here. We need to extend this. Yeah.
No, absolutely, man. So, I see the point you're making there, but again, that comes up for me in a context of similar to like TRT considerations. Essentially, it's looking at the prep,
Oh,
looking at the
that was
negatives,
right. Yeah.
looking at the negatives that arise, and then saying, right, how can we mitigate as much of this negative effect as possible? And that's when, with the natural females that are kind of dipping their toe in, we now open up replacement therapy of sex steroid hormone, testosterone, or also replacement of thyroid output to negate the negatives of natural dieting processes and regulation adjustment that occurs. Now, if you have a female who, now again specific to the context, is dieting year after year, going from comp to comp, their thyroidal axes will be terrible. Eventually, it's going to hit a point of negative return on investment, and thus replacing exogenous thyroid absolutely makes the most sense. The data supports it's fantastic for euthyroidal people to do so because we know there's no concern at the end. Restart 14 days to 21 days average, pretty safe pathway to manipulate if we want to try and achieve thyroidal consistency. But that's a consideration that I don't necessarily look at in the off season. I would start that with the competitor during the prep timeline and then go, right, are you going to continue this? Are we going to keep competing frequently? Are we going to start going down that process of maybe chasing a bigger goal like your pro card? Where we're going to go constantly because you're at that point of muscularity where we don't need so long to grow? Are you chasing Olympic qualification? What is it? Maybe it makes a bit more sense to just leave that in consistently the entire time through prep off season and continue that exposure to keep consistency within the regulation. You'll find that, both dieting phases and surpluses do go slightly more efficient when we run up to top levels of thyroidal output. You'll need to decrease calories and continue catching that thread of decreasing as you go is obviously far less. But in the same front, on the opposite end of that, you don't find yourself having to outfeed the surplus to continue that progression on as much. My own context, seeing that exact thing plan out, I end up on like 1,000 calories less food with greater scale weight, greater progression from one off season to the next, just keeping thyroid in. So
Hmm.
yeah, I agree there. Absolutely, you can see that. But for me, it's like knowing when to employ that, and it's not something I'd like consider in the earlier stages until prep comes up, where it makes a bit more of a valid argument.
I'm assuming there'd be exclusions to that rule there, though, if there was someone who was
Absolutely.
out of range. Yeah.
If I see you out of range, then we consider all cases in point.
Yeah. The only reason I do raise that as well is because I do find it's quite common to observe females with thyroids on the low end. Very rarely like out of range. But it's quite interesting because a lot of people consider thyroid as like a rule of thumb incorporation in the context of a prep, which is fair enough. Although I've coached a number of males specifically who you get to that last little tail end of prep and you run the thyroid labs and they're still jamming, which is strange. I've never actually done my thyroid labs on the tail end of a deficit. So I wouldn't even know what they look like. Yeah.
I've seen mine drop quite harshly. So I just after I saw mine low, chucked him in on a prep and just kept him in consistently from that point onwards. Even now, I still use T4 just because I don't see the point in taking it out. It impacts my progression definitely better. So yeah, no, it's a consideration for all preps. I always have it as a question mark. We always talk about it before the prep even begins that we might need to use exogenous thyroid replacement. But whether it happens or not is very much blood work specific. And in some cases, the majority are going to see down regulation and a need for replacement. But sometimes you do come across some interesting cases. Obviously, the answer there would typically just lie in genetics. simply for that person.
Yeah, because a very thyroid as well as another. The reason I raise that is because another very much demonized one in these parts. But it's difficult to have someone understand that no, we're looking at thyroid replacement dosages. We're not looking at pushing super physiologically like we have observed in like bodybuilders across the last 20 years. Which I don't think. Well, I've never done that with anyone, so I wouldn't know. Yeah.
Data on it. There is mixed data on it. The large portion of it seems to support that upregulating the deficit via thyroidal axes is probably your worst bet for catabolism and running risks of at a point where you're already chronically depleted, then cranking the dial on your metabolic rate quite hard is probably going to lean into a bias of chunking through some amino acids as energy as opposed to carbohydrates and fats because of a short-term time frame to stress response in that situation. But there are also some smaller studies that actually support T3 upregulated in superphysiological might actually be beneficial for maintenance of tissue. So it's like, okay, now we've got two conflicting things. Which data looks more reliable? Typically, the bigger amount that we do have in the older research, I still lean more toward that. There have been very rare situations where I've needed to utilize T3 superphysiologically and only in certain cases. And I will say with my bigger individuals, I may be a little bit more liberal to the conversation when you're talking to a 120 kilo bloke who's on his way down pretty diced, maybe there's a conversation to get that last little bit off the glutes.
Mm,
Nuance, maybe certain situations, but most of the time, not at all.
agree. And we'll just jump back as well. So after we do consider all the pathways, which we've sort of gone over, would your next topic be the testosterone replacement? Would you
Absolutely. So
want to
first thing we'd
call?
be doing is saying, right, what is the next leverage that you want to take within your career? What is the next goal? Does it now open a conversation with the goal to potentially push into the enhanced space? Is there a want to anyway? I'm not once upon a time I used to be against people without competitive goals using enhancements, apart from very minimally. Now, come on, it's 2025. If you want to take the risks and do what you want to do, that's fine if there's no major end goal. So a starting point would be to check blood serum levels. Take a look, see what the sex steroid levels are like internally, and then see if typically replacement is actually going to achieve a great degree of effect. Now, if we're having a prep conversation, we know it's going to come up for a case because we're seeing that downregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axes over time. So we can then implement that to offset that. But if the competitor's just thinking about upregulating progress, take a look at sex steroid hormones, see where the level is, because they might be on the lower to mid range of natural female production, and thus increasing that leverage of TRT up to the top end is going to then drive a profound amount of large effect in their progress. We're thinking about taking most individuals that do sit, in my opinion, anecdotally, what I've seen around that mid region of kind of testosterone production. We're taking them and we're manipulating their internal up to kind of genetic elite parameters. We're thinking like track and field Olympians, females that are just the top of their sport. When we look at the data on top athletes, they all in the female space have genetically elite levels of testosterone and they're at the top end of that cusp. So if we see a need, we can bring that straight up to the top end. That absolutely will make a profound ability and effect in their progression in hypertrophy, but also negates one big problem, which is that they're not going to virilize providing they abide by the laws of natural parameters. So long as we're not going super physiological, we're not now incurring the negative. And that's where I kind of, I started writing a bit of an ebook last year, kind of that middle ground for what competitors who are trying to negate the negatives, but try and promote some degree of positive would try and sit in this little middle ground, which is, replacement therapy of all parameters to negate the consequences of dieting, but not take the risk of super physiologically enhancing and the additional factors that come from stress in that aspect. There is a sweet middle ground that females could look to and sit in, which would negate all of the negatives and create the most stress-free environment to do this thing that we love.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting as well. Yeah, because I feel like as well, HRT is incredibly difficult to source here. You probably also that. Yeah, so that becomes almost difficult consideration as well. But also getting the lab work from females. Do you find difficulty in in balancing other sex hormones throughout the course of HRT?
So there's kind of three scenarios I see coming from embarking on exogenous testosterone replacement. You either have a couple of cohorts. So one would be little to no change of any on their endogenous sex steroid hormone production, and That's the ideal situation, least changes on estrogen, progesterone regulation, FSH, LH. Then there's a group where the majority will fall, which is what we'd say is a partial suppression, where you might see a very slight decreased amount of endogenous estrogen, progesterone, FSH, LH, but still all very much within the confinements we deem appropriate for health and fine, as long as we're negating all the negatives and the menstrual cycle is still regulating correctly, phases are not changing in length, duration, fine. And then the third cohort, which is the one we want to try and avoid, which is a full suppression of the HPO axis. And if we do fall into that group, which you do come across because of genetic reasoning, age-related concern, if you take a female that's close to their perimenopausal timeline anyway, and we stick them on a form of replacement exogenous hormone, there's a good chance we're probably going to see this timeline that's very close get a little bit closer. We're
Mhm.
going to see these things kind of embark and start in those processes. So age is a concern, and also general timeline. So once you've seen that full suppression on the blood work, you then run back and say, right, we need to cover estrogen and progesterone. Now, if we do this, there is larger consequence to fertility. There is a bit of a larger consequence in that regard to endogenous production. If we stay here, the longer we stay suppressed in this state, and thus you know, we need to really have that conversation. It might only seem small on the outside to some people, but the choice is the thing that I want all of my girls to have at the end of this career path is the choice for some life decisions. They might not want to have kids, that's fine. But if the choice gets taken away,
Mhm.
that's when negative, horrible conversations that don't need to be had start being had. There's obviously things you can't get away from, some genetic specifics within certain individuals, but for the most part, we want to approach things safely to give everyone the most amount of choice at the end.
And I agree because you need to make sure as well, like we touched on, the fact that they understand all the risks which they're incurring with potential administration from the smallest to the largest risks. And a lot of people, when they are in that window, especially you see this more so in males, but when females are in that window where they are very set on the competitive outcomes, these aren't taken into account. And also they'll take into account, oh, but I have the friend that did this and didn't run into any issues. And it's like everyone
Well,
runs very
even
different. Yeah.
menstrual cycle in one female from one month to the next can vary massively, let alone the individuality between one female and another female. So, who's to say that your response to drugs is going to be much the same? Well, it is. It's going to be completely varied.
And then from
How
there,
does
I'll go, Izzy.
how does the conversation differ between individuals, females category wise? So do you find that, say, like wellness athletes, or like women's physique athletes, for example, are a lot more open to obviously the side effects compared to, say, bikini? How does that go just altogether?
So criteria specific enhancement practice is very much the case as to how you would look at this. You look at criteria and you say, right, a woman's physique or woman's open competitor is going to need a level of muscularity that sadly cannot be achieved naturally unless you are the needle in the haystack, the one percenter who just is a freak. And they do exist. There are females that are incredibly feminine but have a very masculine look muscularity naturally. And it does happen, but it's very fucking rare to come across. Really, really rare. So realistically, what we're looking at is as the criteria or the classes are going up in muscularity and condition, typically so too is the enhancement practice that's running alongside the class that you're trying to embark upon. I have a very firm belief that the majority of bikini competitors do not actually need anabolic and androgenic steroids. There's a large degree of other exploited options they could be dabbling with here that would probably achieve over maybe a slightly longer term, but still achieve same endpoints for muscularity, overall density, size, and condition. You see here's horror shock stories of bikini girls using things like Winstrol and stuff like that. And you think, fuck, why? What on earth is there a reason for the condition and the criteria to meet this? And as you mentioned, wellness, figure, physique, open, as you work up the category, it does get higher and higher. The problem with the top two categories is that for me as a coach, I don't mind working with physique, but I probably won't work with open just due to the I'd have to have a very, very in-depth, informed conversation with a woman's open bodybuilder for me to be comfortable and ethical, taking them on that journey, knowing that these changes they're seeing morphologically and physiologically are permanent. So that's something I would have to be. This person is completely all in. There is no issues with what is to come. They are very aware of when they stop bodybuilding and lose all that mass, they're still going to be virilized. it's not going to be a great look at a virilized bodybuilder who's now lost all of their size. It's not going to be the best kind of position to land in. If they're all good with that, then maybe there's a rare instance where I might break that rule. But in the most part, I don't think anyone can forecast their thoughts and their psychology and spirituality to that point in their life where they could think how they would respond. You can't decide that until you get there. So the common issue I see mainly is that girls go straight to wellness from bikini and they immediately think that drugs need to be used. There's obviously the differentiation between IFBB Pro in the NPC ranks down to amateur NPC. There is that to consider that we're going to see a different level of muscularity in amateur wellness females compared to pro wellness females. And the reality when you speak to some pro wellness girls, like at the Olympia, there was a few that I was chatting to, and when you actually with the quite open about what they do, when you hear what they're running, you kind of go, fuck.
Mm.
Okay. Well, that's news to me that to achieve this, you're having to take X, Y, Z, and it usually is a lot higher than we think. But when we're looking at amateurs, again, I still think that this is a genetic thing that should be differentiating your class specific goals. Like if you're a wellness female, you suit wellness because of your look, your density. The additional things to promote that and drive progress come after. You shouldn't be trying to drug yourself into wellness in the amateur ranks, in my personal opinion.
Do you ever have, or do you ever get on consultations with individuals who say, like, have done a season of bikini, or they have, say, aspirations to do wellness, but they just don't have, like, the genetic potential, or just structurally, that they don't suit it?
Absolutely. If I structurally don't think they suit it at all, I'll be brutally honest, and I will say
Yeah.
that straight up. First point in case. It doesn't mean we can't move up category as your development improves, but if you're not wellness, you're not wellness. The
Mm.
specific bone structure that we're looking for, insertions that we're looking for to meet the capacity of the criteria. So there's nothing wrong with, say, moving up a class, but first off, I'll be brutally honest with where I see that physique going in regard to structure and where they fall. But if a woman said to me, hey, look, I want to push for wellness, I'm not wellness, I have the potential to be, because again, bikini wellness, there is some similarities. Just again, a lot more muscle mass on that lower. It now opens up the conversation of are you willing to accept the risks on embarking on this journey and what level of risk are you willing to take? Because if we go down the non-virilizing route and make tons of progress and she grows into wellness, then great. But if she now wants to, as an amateur, jump into AAS, again, I may not say no, I may not be against it, but this person has to be informed on the risks they are taking, what that might mean for their later life. And usually that conversation kind of funnels out the people that do and do not want to.
Yeah.
I do find as well there is a bit of a misperception around the PED requirements for wellness. Not to say that that's the way that it needs to go, obviously, because we're considering this whole longevity, long-term concept, which is generally not considered. I want to touch on two things here too, but only the guys or people who have coached wellness or have been around people who coach wellness slash that wellness athletes knows, like you just said, what these girls are doing. And when the females want to move up to that category because it looks nice and they think, oh, it's not that much bigger than bikini. I think
Yeah.
the weight of the requirements, and no one wants to get up there and not be even in the mix. So the reality is, you're not going to pursue a category for years and years on end if you're on the bottom every single year. But the reality is, I personally believe, whether you want to disagree or not, if you're not genetically predisposed to wellness, that is, you are going to have to make up some portion of it with drugs. But there is certain bodies which aren't going to be able to make up that portion with drugs regardless. But again, it's very rare to really, like, I've never personally met a female who I've looked at and been like, that girl with just a little bit of a dabble could make it. Like, I'm not
It's never
sure. It's
it's
never,
never really that case. Even when you get into the pro ranks, you're still typically looking at people that are going to have to push quite hard to achieve this level of physique. Wellness is not naturally achievable, to be honest.
yeah.
When you look at natural wellness, competitors, not to slate on the natural federations at all in any way, because I'm a big advocate for it, and I just think it's probably more admirable in most cases than enhanced bodybuilding with how stress-free we can make it for ourselves. But when you look at natural wellness athletes, there is a tendency to see just a higher degree of body fat and not as much muscularity as some may realize.
Mhm.
Coaches probably do because it's criteria specific, but the individual probably thinks they have a lot more muscle mass on that lower than what is actually body fat.
Yeah, because it is usually the girls with the, we're going to say, thicker lower halves that go for it. But even then, like, we can look back to like bikini as well. If you don't have it, you don't have it.
completely.
That's often the case. And the point that I was actually going to touch on before that I almost forgot about was it's not unusual to see girls utilize, I was going to say here, I'm going to try to keep it professional, they utilize PEDs and they actually push themselves away from the criteria because they think by utilization of this, I can grow my glutes or I can cap off my delts or whatever. But then as a result, they start to see development in areas which is not favorable, and they lose, to me, they almost lose that polish, which is going to see them at the top of that ranks. Because I've seen multiple girls like season to season, they're working at it, working at it, working at it, and you can just see that you can even see their faces changing. But you can start to see striations in their delts in the next season. You start to see their glutes quite up to speed, but their abdominals are starting to separate a lot more, and they're starting to gain that separation through the quads, and the quads are starting to develop. And it's like you looked more bikini 2 years ago when you
Yeah.
thought you were too small. And the reality is, if they probably just played that long game, like we mentioned, maybe they could have gotten there, exclusive to those who just don't have it, like I mentioned before.
Absolutely. I think again, modern day era though, our mindset as younger individuals definitely is less patient than that of the older generations. We live in a world of Amazon Prime, next day delivery, everything is tomorrow. And I find that in physique development, the younger the people I speak to, the more there is this drive for I want it now, not I want to be a bodybuilder for the lifestyle and embark upon the return that is physical and again mental, psychological, that's going to embody this for years, decades to come. They just want like this short term, I want to get jacked, I want to get this done. And it's empty kind of passion for the industry and the sport.
Mhm. And I always wonder, man, like I'm sure you've been pretty heavy before, yeah? What's the heaviest weight you've ever been?
122 was my heaviest, and I sustained it for a decent bit of time, to be fair.
I got to 104, which was my heaviest with Joe around like it would have been September. And I'd tell people I'm one because I'd always ask, what are you weighing? Because you're obviously looking a bit bigger. I'd be like 104 and be like, fuck, I'd kill for that. And I'm like, you probably wouldn't. I had sleep apnea. I'd be tired all day. I'd wake up in the mornings and I'd be like, fuck this day, man. Like, and I just thought to myself, imagine me 10 kilos leaner, yet 10 kilos more muscle. That would be worse.
Absolutely.
So I always wonder why, like, you just get even lifestyle guys, they want to be huge. And it's like, do you realize how uncomfortable it is being that big?
I
Yeah.
think until they get some experience, they probably won't. But I can say this, I'm not this overly jacked guy as well. When I was 120, you got to appreciate I am also just over 6 foot tall, so it's a lot wider display to carry that weight. My average sitting point of just doing nothing is around 100 kilo, just because I'm quite tall and wide in bone structure. But to live at that weight and hold that weight for as long as I did, working up from sort of 110 to that 122 mark over like 6 months,
Mm.
fuck, that was harder than prep. There was
Mm.
living at that state was just as stress inducing as what the latter stages of comp prep can be because of, like you said, the sleep apnea, the lethargy, the issues of cognitive function and impairment due to those realities, constantly feeding, eating all the time, feeling stuffed, feeling bloated, cardiorespiratory activity starting to decrease because you are just getting them a lot larger and heavier. There's a lot of negatives to this pursuit, and people really need to love the sport to take on all those negatives. It's a much harder state of life to live in to be a big guy, especially now when you throw in the fact that you can't pull off the body fat to get it down again because you're already, a shredded lean 115 or whatever you've worked up to. You just that's you, that's your normal.
Mhm. I actually have a guy at the moment who wants to lose, like he wants to start downsizing. And I did say to him, it's gonna be it's actually a lot more difficult than you probably think it's going to be. Yeah.
Not
At least while trying to hold a decent physique.
Well, that's the trade-off. It's like trying to maintain progression and or maintenance of muscularity in some areas whilst reducing others. It's like
Mm.
this is where that kind of category change also starts to become really interesting and very hard to do. Like you're trying to downsize a wellness person to bikini. Fuck, like that's a very hard pursuit I'm in at the moment. It's all of the negative processes that we would try to positively impact for hypertrophy, we now have to dysregulate in the opposite form. Low protein environment, deficit state to again support catabolism, whilst also keeping training stimulus appropriate on areas isolated to those areas, so we don't get too much secondary and tertiary stimulus that can then mess up what we're trying to do and provide stimulus to muscles that we're trying to reduce. It all becomes very complicated and sticky, and you've got to navigate between these little parameters.
Yeah, it's almost like an impossible pursuit though.
I like dealing with impossibles.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can't say I've ever dealt with that. This will be the first time I've actually had someone say to me, like, I'm done. Like, I want to downsize, but I want to stay in good shape. And I'm sort of sitting there like, oh, this is new, but okay, we'll do our best. One thing I actually had the question right here as well. Like, It's not unusual to see girls just think if they introduce PEDs, like let's just say introduce Anabara or Primobolan in the context of their prep, we'll talk bikini specifically. They do feel like they're going to make a substantial improvement in that prep through the activity of the drug. Obviously, we know there's going to be retention there. What kind of observations do you have here? So let's just say someone comes in with not lackluster, we're going to say just mediocre muscularity, and then you were to bang in Anavar for those last 8 weeks. Do you feel like that would make a substantial difference compared to whether you just managed all their parameters and put them on stage naturally?
I think it will make a substantial change to the cosmetics, but whether that is positively influencing your outcome on stage day or negatively impacting it is up for the judges to decide based on criteria. Because as we know, PEDs are not selective. That is everywhere the androgen is going to be binding and driving that affinity. So we have to appreciate that muscularity is definitely going to improve, whether that is via intramuscular fluid retention driven from nitric oxide increase, or whether it is actual solidified tissue. Again, I challenge if you're using drugs for short term, 6, 8 weeks, which we can talk about the parameters of AAS use in a moment. But if you are using for 6 weeks, don't expect those changes that you see on the surface to last very long out the gate. Once you remove that stimulus, that muscle is not going to typically remain because the environment by which you added said tissue, however small, is now not there. Do I think it's going to make a big difference? I think it is, but perhaps not because of muscularity, but more so fluid retention, nitrogen retention that supports cosmetically improving the physique in the short term. And again, if you think more nuanced as to the position the athlete is landing in, if we're in a position where we're ready very early and overly lean, we can utilize Anavar with a bit more food to potentially promote some better outcomes on the leading up in. But that's very nuanced and very specific to the individual in context.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like this whole listen is like a great is just like a gold mine for people. The
Yeah.
reason I did raise that as well is because not I've noticed that it's not unusual to see some females banging the VAR, expect it to make such a difference in just like a 6 to 8 week window in the prep to get to the end and just become disappointed.
I think there's a misdemeanor in us as well. When we speak, we say that females are androgen sensitive, right? So it's like, oh, you get such greater return than us. And that's what they'll hear on podcasts. They hear it from education all the time that women get better results from AAS than males do. But they miss off the fact that it's on like a milligram per milligram basis. It's not like, you're still not taking 300 megs plus of PEDs. The quantity will outweigh the result here for us as males. And there's that contrast between, oh, that male's using enhancements. Look at their off season rocket starts blowing up because they're a little bit genetically lucky. That's not going to translate to females. The dosage and considerations are so far different. And although sensitive, you're sensitive to the negatives, not just the positives. So
Treading a
it's
line.
not going to do
Yeah.
what they want.
Yeah, because you're almost treading, you tread a line throughout the whole course of the exposure as well. And we obviously need to acknowledge that some females, when they are in that tunnel vision mode, same with males. In a prep, I'm sure you notice this too. With males, you can throw anything you want at people and they'll do it when they're 7 weeks out. And it's going to be no different for anyone else. So you almost, as a coach, become the one responsible for keeping on top of
Absolutely.
those elements because they'll all almost forget. I'm sure you've been there in a prep as well, where you get to that 4 weeks and you're like, fuck it, what else can I do?
Dude, Joe protein only me protein spared modifying fast for 12 weeks.
Wow.
And you like you said, that coining that mentality of do whatever it takes. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
whether it's drugs, whether it's nutrition, whether it's expenditure. Doing like there were past preps when I was with other coaches where I'd do 2 hours on the stairmaster because that mentality is like I'll do whatever it takes. That's
Mhm.
not a great trade-off when it comes to the drug realm.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I actually had a prep where I was doing an hour and a half a day. That was
Yeah, ridiculous city older approaches.
wow.
But the considerations fall very much on our behalf, and I think that's why coaches who are working in this space have an absolute obligation to understand the parameters of enhancement and how to actually appropriate that with a female in as least damaging context as possible. It's not to say that there's anything safe about a female using enhancements, and we have to squash a myth, which is, just because we apply these practices does not null and avoid you from virilization because we appropriately look at what little limited data we have to make this decision. Once you open up that dial, once you crank that virilizing dial, even the smallest degree, with as little androgens as possible, there are permanent changes in your physiology and morphology that are starting to incur. And it is a game of balancing that over the course of your career. And there is obviously going to be females that are more genetically prone to this. There are going to be females that you typically see go all the way to the Olympia because they can handle drugs with way less negatives. You see them all the time, the figure girls that still look incredibly feminine but really jacked. They're not doing anything different to most people. It's just they have a really great genetic response where they don't start to masculinize through their jawline, see facial hair growth, see changes in their clitoral enlargement, changes to uterus morphology. They're just not as prone to those in the same way we get more males with some side effects, more males with others.
Mhm.
But the parameters we normally apply here to try and restrict this exposure to what we deem minimally appropriate, there is some data supporting a duration of exposure being the biggest player, right? So for females, it tends to be less of a dosage conversation as much as it is an exposure timeline conversation. The reason and the mechanism by which we see this is still not completely well understood, but once we get past sort of a 6 to 8 week average window of enhanced exposure for a female in the supraphysiological space, we see a massively sharp bend on the curve of virilization where it starts to ramp up really hard and fast, even though the dosages remain the same past the average 6 to 8 week mark. So that already puts a confinement of some parameters in line. You're going to be virilizing to a very minimal degree for this first window of time. Past this point, we're going to see things crank up, even though the dosage doesn't change. So that now means that realistically, females should first off not be using enhancements for longer than 6 to 8 weeks. When you're starting this out and you're going into your first exposure, you're probably condensing that to 4 weeks alongside tracking of virilization to start to figure out your genetic differences. Can you go for 8 weeks of exposure? You don't know that. So you track virilization qualities during the first exposure, stop at 4 weeks. Maybe on the next run, we have a conversation about going to 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Again, tracking virilization consequences so we can create informed decisions with this individual and create a big picture of all the ways these drugs interact and work with this individual.
Mhm.
Duration of exposure, but then also duration of exposure away from short term onto the long term. What are we looking at on, say, like a 12-month window? If we look to like off-season prep, 12 months, just realistically, just to give it some numbers. Well, there's only 2 points that really make sense. Coming into contest prep, 6 weeks to drive that cosmetic benefit to enhance the physique due to the criteria and due to the goals we're trying to achieve. That's one. The next point would be when momentum's built to its fullest, progression in training is building and moving really well. Food is at its highest. Well, other ancillary usages at that point of the other non-virilizing PEDs, growth, insulin, etc., they should all be in at quite high effect and all rolling. So the polypharmacy model's already in effect pretty much. Now, if we add that additional anabolic leverage for 6 weeks at the end of the off season, when we're at our peak of exposure to every other parameters that are driving hypertrophy, both non-pharmacological and just general in the progression of physique development, we can now enhance that tenfold with that combination of all factors. So then we get this kind of 2 opportunity 6 week exposure windows that make sense. So over a 12-month window, I'm only looking for 12 weeks of exposure.
Mhm.
But now we have the dabble of frequency, where it's like, okay, well, if there's 12 weeks across the year that I can manipulate, couldn't I do 3 hits of 4 weeks?
Mhm.
Okay, well, no, because the frequency of crossing into this window is what's upregulating your virilization. The more frequently we cross that barrier, the more you are leaky faucet, dropping virilization into your metaphorical cup. And at some point on this 10, 20-year timeline, maybe if you go the long distance of competing, that cup is going to be getting fuller, 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 fuller. Once it spills out the top, that's it. Once virilization's visual, once it's out there and it's formed and you can see it, it's not going anywhere. You're just adding more fuel to the fire.
And just for reference for anyone listening, we are referring to anabolic and androgenic steroids when we're talking about the two 6 week exposures. Everything else we have mentioned would be more, I
Chronic
guess,
exposure.
long-term exposures.
As,
Yeah.
as long as you can utilize it, like insulin as well. If you can have an individual who's eating high enough to run insulin long term, you're going to get a greater benefit from that action and polypharmacy. But again, it's context to how much food is the individual eating, where is their insulin sensitivity, what's their blood sugar regulation like, because you can't just use it all year round. But it does make a case you want to use these non-virilizing PEDs for as long as exposure as you can allow with all the other confinements to it. But no, we're just speaking on AAS. So dosage doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. Duration of exposure and frequency of exposure seems to be more of a concern. The dosage consideration. So if I put some context here and say I had a female in, say, woman's figure or open or physique that said to me, I want to push a bit harder. Well, I would probably not look to add in another exposure window or a longer exposure window. I'd look to manipulate higher drug load in that 6 week window because that seems to, again, if we're going to use more drugs, we can keep it to the confinement of 6 weeks and not see this rapid change on the curve past that point. So if we are going to dabble and push a bit harder, which I'm not completely against, but within nuanced conversation, has to be done appropriately. Let's move the milligram harder a little bit and a degree up rather than just extend the duration of exposure because it seems to be the less influential comparatively between those three factors.
Hmm. As well as though when we look at intensity of exposure or dosage as well, obviously we're talking within like a reasonable parameter. So you're not going to pump in like 30, 40 megs of var a day.
No, 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 no. So yeah, this again, the dosage considerations realistically, we're looking at somewhere in the vicinity of sort of 35 to 70 milligrams, like top end for most people per week, that is. So that might look like your typical 5 milligrams of Anavar per day, and that will give you your 35 milligrams across the week, or it could be 10 milligrams of Primobolan 7 days across the week, and that's going to achieve 70 milligrams. But we're somewhere within that parameter, sort of 35 to 70 in most cases. And then when we move up sort of to like, I don't want to say figure, but the reality is when you get into figure, most of these girls are doing this, pushing a little bit harder, maybe to like 100 milligram per week. Like that's not unrealistic. I've not, it's not like I've not come across it multiple times, but definitely physique and open, we're cranking that dial perhaps up to like 140, maybe even more closer. So like 2 to 4 milligram per kilogram in some cases with those bigger girls. So moving into more of that male like cycle design setup.
It's not unusual though to hear of girls running male, like low end male kind of setups. I've heard some atrocious stories. Yeah, obviously, you do have to take every story that you hear with a grain of salt as well. Yeah, because I heard one story the other day about a coach, and I raised it on a podcast this morning with a friend. But I said to him, "There's no way that's true." Do you know what I mean? Like I know the guy. Like there's no way that's true. And if it is, well, fuck. But
Yeah, yeah.
you always got to
I
take it with a grain of salt. Yeah.
Nations of Australia, man. I've seen some shocking cases. I think again, like compound selection is so important, and for you guys, one of the issues is lack of ability to find and source legitimate products. There was a Tim, I can't remember his last name. It's an Eastern European sounding name. He's doing Dr. Tim. He's doing some clinics across the East Coast, Gold Coast, Brisbane way, I
Yeah.
think,
Mm.
like testing, right, for testing of anabolic and androgenic
Yes, he,
steroids. And
I know. I didn't know his name was Tim, but I know about the clinic. Yeah.
pretty sure it is, or it's T something. But
Yeah.
yeah, I might be butchering that if you're listening, mate. Dreadfully sorry. But the work he's doing is fantastic. But what it's showing us is that majority of the oral steroids that we're seeing from labs in Australia typically either aren't what they say they are, or they have a lot of heavy metals in the compounding. So, it's one, not good for health, but for females, even more of a consequence when you're buying Anavar that's actually more stanozol or anadrol, and the androgenic profile of these compounds is vastly different. The anabolic potential of all of the steroids is relatively the same in our cohort of dosaging. There's no one greater for muscle building effect. But when we look at the androgen consequence, that varies drug to drug. And it does leave us with a conversation of there are a couple that seem to meet the criteria better, less androgenic. So that would be Primobolan, which we actually have some female data on running really high in post
Yeah.
breast cancer treatment, anti-estrogen effect, sort of over a gram of Primo a week, which a case in point that comes back to female enhancement as again, as a generalization here is that the problems aren't like males. We don't see renal toxicity, liver toxicity, lipid problems, heart, brain, pancreas. We don't see those issues arise at the dosaging we're playing with in female recreational use. But obviously, the individuals in that study, over a gram usage of Primo, they started to see some slight impairment, not all of them, but some of them in some of those systems. But obviously, virilization very much apparent with that gram usage. So Primo seems to come up as a choice because of its lesser androgen potential. MPP's also been used, but I mean, quite poorly, I'd say, in some studies when you see the changes on the visual imagery that they have in females. Anavar also comes up as context again. Maybe not my preferred, but due to its additional vectors to and changes to lipids. So the changes there in dyslipidemia, adjustment to LDL and HDL cholesterol ratios that might be a low-hanging fruit for long-term longevity, makes more sense to go with an injectable over an oral. But yeah, so that's the compound thing comes back to its androgen profile, and there are certain drugs that have lesser androgen ability and androgen consequences in the system, and thus they should be the ones we lean toward. We wouldn't want to use something like anadrol, halotestin, or something along those lines in a female because it's just or proviron can be utilized in some rare nuances, but the
Mhm.
most of the time we're taking a drug that's lowering SHBG that's just going to allow for free testosterone to run higher. Thus, if we're super physiological and driving higher free test levels, virilization's going to be very apparent.
Yeah, I've heard plenty of times as well with Bavarian, and I've never really understood.
Nuanced apply. I
Yeah.
get absolutely. I think there are definitely some specific cases where there might be some problems with estrogen, testosterone, progesterone balance, and
Mm.
sometimes it could make a difference if you're running labs to make that implement pharmacologically. But for the most part, it's used quite bullishly and not with those parameters in play.
The cases that I've heard are definitely not used in consideration of that because the guys that I know that utilize it wouldn't even understand the
It's
hormone.
like if we was to
Yeah.
leverage, what are we trying to do at the end of comp prep that they might be doing with Proviron? Well, it's trying to drive again a harder, more androgen-like look. Well, guess what? All of the other drugs you're potentially considering, Primo and Anavar, are doing a similar thing anyway.
Mhm.
They come with a greater anabolic cost here in regard to progress, which is great. So it's already better than Proviron, but it's not affecting free testosterone in the same way. So it's achieving a similar result, a slightly higher androgen profile, but it's coming from a compound that was originally intended for women anyway, with that diversifying of the ability to convert to estrogen and DHT. They were made for the androgen sensitive in intention. Let's not increase free testosterone with Proviron and that bias. Let's just increase a bit more of these other drugs that we know are slightly more tolerable than that.
Mm. Did you have any further questions, Izzy?
Not really. I
You've
have
done
one,
you
but
you fucking this is a masterclass, bro.
mm,
Uh,
Appreciate
yeah.
it, man. I'm just trying to think, is this such an in-depth topic that obviously nuance and context massively applies to? So there's obviously going to be X's and O's to this conversation that might be different. I'm just trying to think if there's any general consensus.
Mm.
Little often goes a long way.
I think overall, especially for like the Australian audience, everything that you have said has clarified what seems to come up most consistently as either an issue or just like lack of education overall. And I can pretty much guarantee you that if someone like listened to this, they would take a step back and think, oh, maybe I should consider something else or like other things available prior to diving headfirst. So yeah, really good. And it was like a masterclass.
Yeah. Thanks for jumping on, man. We really that was good.
We appreciate your time, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, work definitely valuable as well. So we'll definitely plug the shit out of this one. This is one of those podcasts I think that you send it to people. It's like when they ask about it, it's like, listen, because I already got a couple that I do that with. I just as soon as they sort of raise a topic, it's like here, then let me know.
That's ever time saving that is as a coach.
Yeah, at least then they have context for the questions that they ask too. Yeah, because I like running them through it, but I like running clients through education. I actually sometimes prefer education to coaching. Um,
So,
yeah,
there's a commonality with most of my clients. If you ever speak to any of them, I tend to over deliver. Sometimes I will admit to a detriment. You take an athlete who's 6 weeks out, they definitely don't want to be listening to my bald head waffling on about some jargon regarding the systems at play here. They just want an instruction. It's like, George, shut up, man. Tell me what I need to eat because I don't have the time or mental capacity for you.
yeah,
But in a general sense, man, my check-ins are sort of anywhere from sort of 20 to 30 minutes long because I hate it. This is how I coach. It's my style. I like to talk about everything that's going on. And there is a lot of context that usually needs to be applied.
yeah. No, that's the way to be though.
I do find too, like I only coach lifestyle individuals, but I feel as though it's a much more satisfying process with like with every adjustment, there's an explanation as to why, because you know that if they understand what happens if they do, what happens if they don't, then inevitably like adherence and just results altogether improve. Same thing like being coached by Joe. Like I love the explanation and the rambles. One, because I'm interested in it, but two, it just makes me feel significantly more competent learning from him each week as well.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and there'll be a time as a competitor that you'll come to where there'll be a time frame where Joe maybe doesn't have and this is the same for all coaches, where they
Mhm.
might not necessarily have an exact explanation due to maybe there not being the explanation in science yet. Like we said with that androgen change on the duration of exposure, like we can't say the system at play yet, but we know it occurs. There might be a time where Joe then has to lean on you, and he won't ever ask the question as no coach would, but the trust me question, right? Whereas we're going
Yeah.
to make decision because I know it's your best interest at heart due to anecdotal and experiential decisions rather than research driven. But because for so long you've had the whys, the who's, the what's, the when's explained to you, there's a level of trust that develops between you and that coach, whether it's Joe, whether it's me, whether it's anyone else. And that allows or and then enables those conversations when they come up for that trust to be had. You know, you can't ask someone to trust you and to put their faith in you without giving them valid reason to before.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
All round smoother coaching process, absolutely.
yeah. No, I 100% agree. And yeah, at the end of the day, man, you want these clients to walk away with education. as
It
well.
also
Mm.
saves time for me. Like I don't want to have to keep rehashing out the same kind of conversation on things over and over and over again. I want
Mm.
them to kind of come up with me in their education and be informed and start asking me the next questions in this topic, start progressing in their understanding because it makes for an overall better relationship between me and the person anyway. We can start diving into some more serious topics that I enjoy.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll wrap it up there, man. Thank you so much.
It's really a pleasure, guys.
Thank you.